The future is a concept. It doesn't exist. As the proverb says, tomorrow never comes. There is no such thing as tomorrow. There never will be, because time is always now.
Welcome to the Philosophical Minds podcast, the podcast about the stuff we wonder about
and other things.
All right, so we're on with Avery Hopkins. He is an operative alchemist. He owns this company called Kymia Arts. That's Kymia Arts, and he sells all different kinds of alchemical products. Avery, you are an interesting person, to say the least. I commend you for all your work. This is a subject that I've been interested in for a long time, but I haven't really had the time, or kind of honestly just been pretty lazy. I haven't really delved into it as deep as you, but you definitely have. And so I'm just excited to talk to you and get your perspective. And I guess I'll start off. I'll let you introduce yourself and kind of talk about how you got started out, and
sure,
I'll do it.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, and kind of throwing some questions my way. Happy to share everything I can, and I'm totally transparent and an open book. So, as you said, I'm Avery. I run it's a study, a practice, and a business called Kymia Arts, and I've been doing that publicly for the last 6 years. I have my private alchemical studies for the last 20, but only in the last 6 years did I become, a public figure where I started to openly teach and produce products that people could buy from the alchemical tradition. So I live out in Taos, New Mexico. I have a lab out here, and I run apprenticeships and workshops. I produce all of my different metallic oils, which is what I'm usually best known for. And yeah, just do my best to demystify alchemy, what it is, and how it's practiced.
Yeah, like you said, you demystify it and you have a simpler definition of it. And I kind of wanted to get you to talk about your definition of alchemy, what it is, kind of the origins of historically where alchemy came from, and all that. So
yeah, so I'll kind of talk about what people think alchemy is. So the majority of time, if you go onto the internet or you're reading a book on alchemy, you're going to run into one of these usual definitions, which is that alchemy is an art of transmutation, or sometimes they say transformation. It was written in Frater Albertus's book that alchemy is the raising of vibrations, which also is a kind of way of saying transformation. If you look at Wikipedia, it says, it's the turning of lead into gold. Some believe it's a metaphor, some believe it's physical, and I try my best to dispel all of that. So what is alchemy actually? The way I define it is alchemy is the understanding of how consciousness relates to matter. So it's a little different, right? And you won't really run into that definition often. I think currently I'm the only one that's using that. But the way I came to that understanding and defined alchemy in that way was by reading the traditional alchemical manuscripts and going back into the past and basically looking at the way that the actual alchemists defined what it is that they did. And the most foundational text in alchemy is the Emerald Tablet. It's kind of where it all starts. So you can't get into a study of alchemy and not run into the Emerald Tablet. Right. It's as far back in history as we go. And this definition is coming from that. It's a modern interpretation of saying a very old and ancient axiom that we probably all know. As above, so below, as within, so without, right? So I have a video on YouTube. I forget what it's titled. I think it's titled An Introductory to Alchemy.
Introduction to Alchemy, yeah.
Yeah.
That one. That's how I found you originally. I think every once in a while I'll go on YouTube, I'll type in, things I'm interested in, and one of your videos popped up there. Just typed in alchemy, and
nice.
There it was. So
yeah. So there's definitely a further explanation in that video, but to just go over it really quickly, if you look at the Emerald Tablet, and in the first opening lines of that book, it says, "That which is above corresponds to that which is below, and that which is below corresponds to that which is above, to complete the miracle of the one thing. So what does that mean? Like, in order for you to understand that, you have to understand their language in the past and see it through their eyes. And also keep in mind that the Emerald Tablet is considered to contain the entirety of the alchemical practice and philosophy. So you really don't need to look any further than that one text. But then, of course, all the other manuscripts will, expand and give you further perspective. But let's go back to that saying, as above, so below. What does that mean? Back then, people would call the above by many different things. It was the heavens. It was the abode of God. It's the immortal realm where the stars and the planets and the creator exist. But it was also considered to be an internal reality, which is interesting, right? Because you're looking up and you're seeing stars and planets, but they understood it to also be the inside. And it was the immortal realm of the creator. But it corresponds to the below. So what is the below? The below is the earth and the physical reality that we all experience every single day. It's, where change and mortality take place. So it's finite, whereas the above is infinite. But the outside was considered the below. So you have the internal realm, which is infinite, and the external realm, which is finite, above and below. And that's kind of how we come to this understanding. I can go way deep into the philosophy further with the 3 principles and the 4 elements, but essentially understanding that the internal reality that we all experience, us, the I am, the consciousness inside here, that is the creator. That is the understanding of consciousness and how it relates to matter, the outside world, or the finite reflection that is generated through our beingness.
Love it. And then I wanted to get you to elaborate on the etymology of love and integrity, because I heard you talk about that in another podcast. So I just wanted to kind of get you to talk about that.
Yeah, that's a really big one, especially as you begin to get into the practice of alchemy. So a lot of people argue with me about this one because etymology can be interpreted. And I just do my best to try to bring it back to the source that makes the most sense in the big picture. So the word love is coming from an old word of leaf, which is where we get our word leave. And it essentially means leave it alone, right? So when you actually truly do love something, it means you just leave it alone. You let it be what it is. You don't try to influence it in any one way. Just let it be there. And that shows that you understand it for what it is. So that word actually kind of corresponds to the word integrity. And that's an old Latin word. And it's made out of 2 words. In, which means no, and tegre, which means to touch. So it means don't touch. To live a life of integrity is to not touch your reality, which is really similar to love, right? Just leave it alone. If you don't touch your reality, it means that you're neither pulling in what you want or pushing away what you don't want. You're letting it be what it is and understanding it for that. So it's a really big part of the alchemical practice, even a scientific practice, because essentially you are let's look at the scientific method for a second. The scientific method was created by alchemists, Shibir specifically, and it was generated so that we, with our human ego, could not fool ourselves into believing something, but instead would simply just observe what was actually taking place, what actually existed. So when you can do that, it actually allows you to render evidence for what might be going on here. And it's a very, very important aspect to not only laboratory work, but the internal work of alchemy. And they go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other.
I love it. It makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of people have a lot of different misconceptions of alchemy, and I just wanted to kind of dispel some of the myths and stuff. So I wanted you to kind of elaborate on some of the work that you actually do in the lab. I know that you make, I think they're called spagyric. Is that what it is? Different spagyrics. I saw you, I think it was on your Instagram or YouTube, you were running around catching, is it crickets or?
Yeah, it was grasshoppers.
Grasshoppers, yeah. So talk about, well, first, this is do you want to first talk about the sulfur, mercury, salt, the different, how they relate to the soul, the spirit, and the body, and then after that, maybe we can go into the different extractions. And
I think that makes sense. Yeah, because in order to understand what a spagyric is, you have to kind of understand the alchemical philosophy, which is pretty simple and really, really cool to look at both internally and externally. But alchemy, the philosophy of alchemy is very straightforward. They would say that everything in life came from one same source. And they called that source the prima materia, the first matter. But from that first matter, as soon as it expresses itself, it always expresses itself in three ways. And alchemists had a coded language. So when you're reading these old manuscripts, you're going to run into this. And they called those three things the sulfur, the mercury, and the salt. So all expression was seen to be a trinity, and that trinity was actually the one, and that one was the source. But what do they mean, right? Like, it doesn't make sense if you don't have an interpretation. So Paracelsus, he was an alchemist in the late 1400s. He wrote very, very plainly in his book On the Nature of Things. He said that the sulfur is the soul, the mercury is the spirit, and the salt is the body. So we have now soul, spirit, and body. But even that can be a little bit weird, right? Because if you go to anybody and you ask them, what's the difference between spirit and soul? I bet you the majority of people are going to say, oh, they're the same thing.
Yeah.
No, they're not at all. And you can see it not only through evidence-based, lab work in alchemy, but the thing that really blew my mind is when I started researching these things early on, I just went to the English dictionary, literally the Webster dictionary, and I looked up these words, soul, spirit, and body, to see what it said. And I found that it wasn't as solid as people have been making it out to be. And our English dictionary has been defining it as such from the very beginning. So it's really cool to look at. Let's just take the body, for example. Everybody thinks they know what the body is because you have a body, you're interacting with bodies all day, every day. It's me and it, whatever the it is. The it can be another person, an animal, a plant, a building, a car, or whatever. So what actually is the body? Well, if you go to the dictionary and define it, it says that the body is a material structure that embodies or gives concrete reality to an abstract thing. So that's kind of a big definition, but I like to pick it apart because it starts to show you how physical reality isn't really as solid as we perceive it to be. So the first part's easy to understand. A body is a material structure, right? We have a material, let's say, if you're building a house, the material is wood, and you build a cabin. And if you structure those materials appropriately, it will embody something. It will now embody the expression of a house. But the definition goes on. It's a material structure that embodies or gives concrete reality. We understand what that means. Solid, real reality, right? To something abstract. And what is an abstract? If you go and look that word up too, you'll find that abstract means an idea. So now you can start to pick apart this definition. The body is just ideas being structured. Ideas are the material. They're being structured. And they are giving the concrete reality. But we know that ideas are not actually solid. You can't grab an idea until it does get structured. So it's pointing back to something that precedes it. So now we know that the salt is the body, and the body is actually just the structured thought forms. So it's pointing back to a principle before it, and that would be the spirit. So what is the spirit? If you go and look that one up in a dictionary, you'll see that it's very easily defined as the mind. Spirit is just the mind. Okay, but that's still kind of slippery, right? How do we understand what the mind is? So I just kept digging through the dictionary, and I looked up the mind. And the mind is defined as an inherent faculty of consciousness. So faculty means power. It's the inherent power that consciousness possesses. So once again, we're seeing the word spirit or the word mind pointing back to something that precedes it. So we now know that salt is the body, and body is just a structured thought. Those thoughts obviously are generated from the mind, the spirit, and the mind is the inherent power that consciousness has. So now we're coming back to the third principle, the sulfur or the soul. So if you look up soul, soul is defined as the actuating cause, the actual cause. The cause of what? Of everything, you know? And what is that cause? Well, we understand it by looking at the word spirit. It's the mind. It's the thoughts, you know? Consciousness inherently exists, or sorry, consciousness just exists, and it inherently has the power to think. Thinking will naturally structure itself and therefore give the illusion of form. So now we understand how any and all experiences are generated. They are generated first by being, which is being awake, being conscious, being aware, right? Then inherently using the only power consciousness has, thinking, and then structuring those thoughts to make reality. If you go back to the definition of what alchemy is, the understanding of how consciousness relates to matter, you can start to see it in this exploration of the three principles. Consciousness, soul, or sulfur, relates to matter, the body, the salt. How does it relate? Through the mind, the mercury, or the spirit. So it becomes really interesting as you understand alchemy more and its philosophies. What you're basically learning is a universal translation device. It's a technology in a way. That's one way of looking at it. It allows you to look at anything inside and outside and immediately understand its origins and, you know, its archetype for expression.
I love it. Yeah, I remember I would be, I don't know, maybe about 6 or 7 years ago when I was first getting interested in the subject. I think I picked up a copy of the Kabbalion or something from a local library, and it talked about different Hermetic philosophy and all that. So I got a copy of that, the Emerald Tablet, a book on Paracelsus, and then I started searching the internet and downloading a bunch of different documents, and I had to, you know, put them in Google Translate to translate them, and man, it was confusing because different terminology and stuff. So I love how you break it down and just make sense of all of it for us. So with that, I guess do you want to go ahead and kind of get into the spagyrics and kind of what the process of that it all is? Or?
Yeah, definitely. So let's take that philosophy right there. Soul, spirit, and body. It's called the three principles. So if you're studying alchemy, this is like the foundational philosophy you have to understand to either practice alchemy or study it. So we have sulfur, mercury, and salt. We can translate that to soul, spirit, and body. We can then give that more modern interpretation of consciousness, mind, and structured thought. But let's say you want to translate it into the physical. You want to take this philosophy and apply it to matter. So philosophies are great, you know, ideas are awesome, but going back to that scientific method thing, you know, it's really in place so that we can't fool ourselves into believing something, because it should be known that no belief is true. All beliefs are opinions, and every opinion is relative, and the truth is not. So if you're going to find fact that defines reality, it cannot be opinionated and it cannot be relative. So if you want to take this into the lab, make it physical, okay, well, then what? What do soul, spirit, and body define physically? It's really cool. So what alchemists would do is they would take some material, plant, animal, mineral, or metal, and bring it into the lab, and then show through the alchemical processes that you could split apart any material, and always it will reduce down to three principal forms. If you take, let's just use a plant, for example. It's the easiest one to start with before it gets much more abstract. Let's say you take a plant into the lab. Usually the first process you do with your plant is you distill it. When you distill it, you'll produce an oil, and we call it an essential oil. It is the essential nature of this thing. It's the actuating cause. Therefore, it is the sulfur, and it's the soul, and it's the consciousness. So if you distill a plant, it will produce an oil. That's your first principle, the soul. Once you've extracted that oil, you can then process the plant matter through fermentation, where it breaks down and it begins to, the sugars and the carbohydrates that make up that plant body are consumed, and it ferments and it turns into a liquor. If you distill that liquor, you get the spirit. And that's exactly why we call spirits, right? When we call alcohol spirits, I mean, And the word alcohol means spirit. It's an old Egyptian / Arabic conjunction. So now we have the second principle, a liquor or a spirit, alcohol, right? We have an oil and we have an alcohol. And then you've pretty much extracted this thing for everything it's worth. And the next step would be to throw your material into the fire and burn it down to an ash. And then you destroy it, you kill it. You have to walk through the fire, and whatever goes through the fire is the truth. And there's a lot of metaphors around that. Look at the phoenix and stuff. So you put it into the fire, you burn it down to an ash, you collect that ash, you wash it with water, and all the soluble salts will go into that solution. And if you filter that water off and then evaporate it, you will actually grow little tiny salt crystals, and that's the body. And now you have nothing left from your starting material, right? You got your sulfur, which is your oil, your spirit, which is your alcohol, and your salt, which is the body, and nothing left of that material. And so it provides evidence that the alchemists really did know what they were talking about. It wasn't just some belief system or dogma or ancient religion or whatever people want to think. It actually can be shown in a lab, but not just with plants. And this is why I do what I do. If the alchemical theory is true, it has to apply to all things. Because if we remember, the philosophy says that everything comes from one source, the prima materia, and that source expresses itself in 3 ways. So if everything is coming from that one source and everything has these 3 principles, then everything has to have a soul, spirit, and body, or an oil, a liquor, and a salt. It's really easy to show with a plant. It's a great place to start in the lab to begin to kind of apprehend what's happening here. But the really amazing part is when you can show that it's possible with rocks and metals, things that should not have any oil in them whatsoever. And they do. Like, let's not fool ourselves. They don't have oil in them, but they are used to catalyze reactions that produce oils and show that, once again, this material has within it, in some fashion, an oil and a liquor and a salt. So that's basically, that's what a spagyric is, or a laboratory practice is, to separate these 3 principles and then recombine them. And that's what the word spagyric means. It means to separate and recombine. So in order to make a spagyric, you get your 3 principles, oil, liquor, and salt. And then once you have them and they're pure and they're clean, you bring them back together, they cohabate, and they make this final spagyric, which is considered a medicine for the body and the mind. So it really can alter your experience inside and out, and works on an extremely profound level.
So yeah, I think a lot of people have heard of essential oils, and that's kind of familiar, but people are going to be like, wait a second, like metals, oils, what? This is something you consume. And I'm sure that you get a lot of like crazy reactions, and people are, afraid to consume it. They're worried about, is this going to be toxic? So how do you respond to those people?
Yeah, I think that's very fair, especially for people that are coming to this for the first time. You see something like the oil of mercury, and you're like, oh, hell no, I don't want to put that in my mouth. Like, we understand what mercury does, and people are getting their mercury fillings removed and everything. So you just got to clear up their misconceptions, because they don't understand what alchemy is and how it works. And that's kind of why I'm here. So I always reassure people that no, there is no metal in the end product. That's the whole point. Like, for example, let's say you're distilling a plant oil, like a lavender oil, and you distill the oil out of the plant material, and the actual lavender stays behind. But the essence of lavender is what's captured. It's exactly the same when I do metallics. From a scientific perspective, it's considered a catalytic conversion reaction, which means that the metal is acting as the catalyst, and it is converting materials, atoms, and molecules to create a new matter, a new molecule, a new chemical. So the metal doesn't actually end up in the end oil. It's being extracted from. That's why it's the oil of mercury or the oil of gold. It's coming from that thing, but that thing is not in it. Otherwise, yeah, that would be pretty detrimental to many people's health. And I'm not trying to poison anyone or do anything. So you just had to kind of show them that it's really just being processed as a catalyst, and the metal stays behind. And that gets reassured so many times through all the purifications and distillations and filtrations and all the different operations it goes through. It's technically impossible for that thing to ever end up in the end product.
Right.
Mm.
So I wanted you to touch on the philosophy of, I think it's Don Juan, was that his name?
Yeah.
The different enemies of man. I think, is it the list?
Yeah, that's coming from Carlos Castaneda. He was an author in the 70s and 80s, and he wrote these books about his apprenticeship as a shaman with this guy named Don Juan. And the very first book he wrote is called The Teachings of Don Juan. And it goes into, meeting this old Mexican shaman and studying with him and learning how to create different herbal extractions that have psychoactive effects so that you can kind of navigate the spirit world. But in that first book, The Teachings of Don Juan by Carlos Castaneda, Don Juan is speaking to Carlos, and he's explaining to Carlos the 4 enemies of man. And he says that, the first enemy of man, am I saying this right? We have power, clarity, knowledge, and death. Yeah, so the first enemy of man is power, if I remember correctly. And once you gain that power, you understand that, you're the one in control of your reality. Then you have clarity, because now you can see clearly. But that too is an enemy. Power can be an enemy. People can be succumbed by that. They can do terrible things with their power. They can misuse it. But if they don't misuse it, they just simply are aware of what they can actually do. That's clarity. But clarity too can be an obstacle on people's paths. Clarity makes you believe that you actually know what's best, and your opinions and your directions and actions are what matter and are what are true. But that, of course, is relative, because that isn't allowing what is to be. It's not love. It's not integrity. It's not in accordance with truth. So clarity can also be an obstacle. And once you have clarity, then and you're not succumbed by it, then you have knowledge, is the way that Don Juan put it. You actually do understand how it all works, and you know that you don't need to do anything. You know that you know nothing. You know that no matter what you say or do, everything is always relative. And so he talks about, being a warrior as well, and how a warrior sits and waits, and he knows not what he waits for, but he knows how to respond when the thing arrives and what that thing will be. So you have your power, your clarity, your knowledge, but then there's the final enemy of man. And Don Juan would say that no one can ever be overcome. No one can overcome the final enemy, which is death. And I would have to agree. Maybe not even in a physical way, because death really just means the end of, or the transition to a new form or a new experience, or however you want to look at it. But whatever you were doing definitely is changing or stopping in some way. And that is kind of a universal truth. We cannot go on existing without change. That would be stagnation, and stagnation breeds, death and pestilence and all the terrible things that no one wants. So in order for energy to transition, it has to flow. In order for life to continue, it has to, keep going, keep consuming, keep creating, keep doing whatever it's doing. So it's kind of a cool little philosophy from, those books and that shamanic practice. And it definitely can lend insight and perspective on somebody's path. But once again, I would like to reiterate that all knowledge, all expression is ultimately relative and therefore not true. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. And this is something else I talk about too, like the purpose of something, the existence of something, or the purpose of an action or whatever. It's always going to be self-defined by the individual. You get to say what you believe is right and wrong, and I get to say what I believe is right and wrong, and none of us are right or wrong. It's just our perspectives, our relative opinions, our beliefs. So I see knowledge in that way as well.
Yeah, I love that. So let's bounce back to the spagyrics. I wanted to ask, how would you go about applying, say, the oil of gold or the oil of silver, and then what are the different purposes?
Yeah, so that goes back to that original alchemical axiom, as above, so below. You know, and one of the ways of looking at the above is the stars. It's up there, and the firmament, the heavens, and everything corresponds to everything down here. So alchemists understood that the planets that they were seeing transit across the sky, they had a correspondence to what we have going on here and what we have going on inside. So each metal I work with currently I offer 9 different metals, but there's the 7 traditional planets of alchemy and astrology: the sun, moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And each one of those planets corresponds to a metal here on the ground. And that metal corresponds to an organ, which corresponds to an endocrine gland, which then corresponds to a mental archetype. So if you understand correspondence, it's called planetary correspondence, then you can understand how to navigate internally and externally, and then how to apply these oils appropriately. So let's say you're really efficient in your lab and you know how to make metallic oils, and now you do have an oil of gold, right? Cool, you got it, there it is, and it's done right, and it's clean, and there's no metal in it, and awesome. What does that do? Why do you want that? You know, what's the point? How do you use it? Okay, so you have the oil, and in the past, alchemists would say that gold relates to the sun, and the sun relates to the crown. So it's the top of your body. And the crown relates to the pineal gland in the center of your brain, which also corresponds to DNA and the heart, and probably a bunch of other things I'm forgetting at the moment. But if you were to consume this oil, which is how it's intended to be used, through what they would call communion, but we could also just call it consumption. You're consuming this oil, and go back to the philosophy, right? The 3 principles. Oil is considered to be the soul of that thing, the actuating cause, the source, the consciousness. So if you take it from your perspective and you're consuming an oil, you're not just consuming an oil, you're consuming consciousness. So its consciousness and your consciousness merge, and they commune and become one. So now you're picking up all the lessons that gold has to offer. They're just weaving themselves into you. And what does gold have to offer? Well, first it has, and it's going to sound crazy spiritual, but it's just the honest truth, pineal activation. It really does. It goes to that center in the brain, it stimulates it, it helps that endocrine gland produce more melatonin and regulate circadian rhythms, your sleeping and waking cycle. It also has a big part to do with longevity and, you know, the fixing of genetic mutations. So as you're consuming it, you're getting these lessons. Gold too is also a sovereign metal. So when you find gold in nature, you usually find it just as gold, right? Gold dust, gold powder, gold nuggets, gold veins. Gold doesn't like to bond with other elements. It doesn't like to corrode. It's sovereign. It just hangs out by itself. Just like the sun, its correspondence, right? The sun is sitting at the middle of our solar system, taking care of itself. It burns its own fuel, it produces its own heat and light, and all the other planets come and orbit around it, and it gives our planet life. So the sun is sovereign, gold is sovereign, and when you take that oil and it stimulates that area, the pineal area, and then has its cascade of effects, it helps you become a sovereign individual as well, meaning that you are self-sustained in all of your own thoughts, emotions, expressions, manifestations, reflections, everything. You become the ultimate responsibility, or the one responsible for everything you experience, which is kind of a hard pill to swallow sometimes. But it's the first step in really engaging in the magnum opus, the great work. And it is great. Emphasis on that.
That's awesome. Are you familiar with Ormus? Have you heard of Ormus? I think there's a dirt farmer named David Hudson who has this whole story about Ormus. So I wanted to get your take on that and what you think.
Yeah, that's a great conversation. So there is what Ormus is, and then there's what Ormus is believed to be, just like alchemy and everything else, right? So you go online, you start searching around, you're going to find all this stuff about this like white powdered monoatomic gold is what they call it. And that's essentially what Ormus means. Ormus is an acronym, ORME, orbitally rearranged monoatomic elements. And then it later got changed into ORMUS with a U, because people believed that they were finding references in the past, but I have never come across those references for real. So I can't say that that's actually valid or it's not, but whatever. So what people call ormus is this white powder, and like 99% of the ormus produced on the market is made through a conversion of sea salt. So usually dead sea salts or Celtic sea salts and lye. And it's a really simple operation. Anybody can do this in their kitchen if they have a dead sea salt and lye and water in some glass jars. If you mix, let's say you mix your dead sea salt in water, so you have salt water, and then you mix some lye in water in a different jar, and you pour the lye into the jar of sea salt, this white precipitate will fall out and it will settle to the bottom like a fluffy little cloud. And if you decant off all that water and wash that fluffy cloud stuff a few times and then dehydrate it, you end up with a white powder, and people call that ormus. And then they say that it's monoatomic elements like gold or iridium or platinum, any of the platinum group metals. But that's just not true. That's actually a chemical reaction that's happening with magnesium. So the majority of the salt in dead sea salt or Celtic salts is magnesium. And magnesium really loves oxygen. It will take oxygen any chance it gets, and then it will stabilize that element. So sodium or lye is sodium hydroxide. It's sodium, hydrogen, and oxygen, and it's very reactive. When you mix these two things together, the magnesium and the sea salt grabs the oxygen from the lye, and it precipitates out as magnesium oxide. So ormus, the majority of ormus and ormus products are actually just magnesium salts. It's not orbitally rearranged. It's not a monoatomic. It's not gold. It's not platinum group metals. So don't be fooled by that.
So,
but yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
In your opinion, does it have any significant benefit to consume it, or?
Yeah, I mean, sure. Like most Americans, but probably a lot of people in the world are magnesium deficient, and it can definitely have value, which is exactly why you hear people have awesome stories. They're like, oh my God, I've been taking ormus for like weeks, and my hair is looking darker and my skin is looking really beautiful and fresh, and my nails are growing faster and I'm sleeping better. And it's like, yeah, because that's what happens when you get magnesium back into your system. So they're just confusing it. So yes, it does have benefit. There's nothing wrong with it, but you're paying, anywhere from $80 to $200 a bottle for magnesium that you could buy for like $3 at Walmart, So you're kind of getting ripped off, and you're being sold a story. And I like to dispel that story. But let's go back to David Hudson, the guy that really made this popular. He owned a farm in Arizona, and he was processing his soil because his soil had gold. He was trying to recover the gold in the soil. And he was basically washing his soil with acid, dissolving the gold out, and then evaporating off or distilling off those acids to leave behind this white powder. And that actually was ormus, orbitally rearranged monatomic elements. It actually was gold, what he was making. And it actually does have really interesting properties.
So was that just because of him getting it from the dirt and it just contained those properties?
So actual ormus has to be a monoatomic platinum group metal. It's the only time it works. And they have really interesting properties at that point, because they were talking about nanotechnology now. Tiny individual molecules where their electron orbit has been altered so that they no longer will bond or even structure with other elements like themselves or anything else on the periodic table. They have become 100% sovereign in their expression as an atom, as an element, right? When you do that, these elements show really interesting properties, like they will just pop out of existence and you can't get them back, or they will act really light or really heavy, or simple electromagnetic forces will push them really far across the room really fast. So that is a very interesting subject, and that is getting closer to alchemy. But I can say for a fact, I have never met anyone that actually has made it And if they did make it, they would never give it away to anybody publicly, because that stuff is scary and it's dangerous. And it's hard to control unless you have a deep understanding of the alchemical practice and philosophy. The majority of people that attempt to make ormus, actual ormus with metal, they do kind of end up with a white powder, but it's unstable. And any heat over about, I don't know, 80 degrees Fahrenheit or even light will cause it to explode in a flash of light. So you can't keep it. It does, yeah, it's really, really reactive.
Yeah, I think I ordered some one time. Who knows if it was, probably fake or whatever, but it had a special wrap. The bottle was wrapped in some kind of insulating material just in case it was to explode or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. But what was I going to say? Oh, yeah. So, because, it was interesting. I was listening to the story with David Hudson, and he was saying how they would put it on all these different microscopes, and they would measure the weight, and it would change from, it would read palladium, then nickel, or whatever. It'd go through a series of different metallic metals, and then the weight would weigh less than it did when they put it on the scale, and then it would disappear in and out of existence, like what you're talking about. So it was just really interesting, and I wanted to get your opinion, but
yeah,
that's awesome.
I would definitely advise that people surfing the internet and reading these stories take everything with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
Don't ever believe anything. Do your own research, see it for yourself. That's a very famous alchemical axiom: see for yourself. Never take anyone's word. But I have done that for myself. I have done that research. I do take these materials into the lab, and I have found similar, maybe not the same, but similar properties. And then I have found more. I have gone further with the research, and I don't really show the world that too much because it really disturbs people. But people are getting confused with what ORM's state materials are and what ormus is. And they will often overlap the information, not even knowing that they're talking about two completely different things. I'll also say, for the people that listen or watch this that are into ormus, make ormus, believe themselves to be making monoatomic platinum group metals, the sodium burn method does not work. It is not actual monoatomic gold. The Agua Regia path does not work. It also does not make monoatomic elements. Every single ingredient and recipe you will find on the internet does not actually make monoatomic elements. So anybody that has gotten their information from the internet, which is, like, as far as I can tell, basically everyone, they're highly confused. The only way I can find that it actually does align with the stuff David Hudson is saying is when you come at it from the alchemical perspective. I have never met another person that understands what that perspective is and then how to approach it in a physical way.
I wanted to talk about mercury. When you were first starting out, you got a huge abundance of mercury, and you were saying that's really important to your process. What do you use your mercury for, and why is it so important?
Ooh. Slippery subject, huh? Okay. Well, let's just talk about what everybody wants to talk about, which is the Philosopher's Stone. When you start to read about it and you hear the stories, you'll usually run into two things. If you can make the stone either is the universal panacea that cures all sicknesses and can potentially help you live forever, physical immortality, or its other main attribute is that it can transmute any metal into gold. So the reason mercury is of great importance or interest to somebody actually doing the great work or alchemical practice in a metallic world is that it's a necessary ingredient. You cannot make a stone if you do not have mercury. And many people will argue this, but the people that argue this are the people that have never made the stone. So I don't really care what they have to say. When you begin to read through the text, you'll come through and see this metaphor, and they will call the beginning ingredient the water that does not wet the hands. So just apply some logic there for a second. Think about it. If you touch a liquid, no matter if it's an acid or some alchemical spirit or anything, it's going to wet your hand in some way. So what is the one thing on the planet that is liquid that cannot wet you? That's mercury. Yeah, it's pretty obvious. So I just gave away an awesome secret to anybody that's like trying to seek and understand what the stone is. You have to have it. You have to have it to make your stone. You have to have it to transmute. You have to have it to multiply. Like, it's a necessary ingredient. And with that ingredient, you really do begin to have great power and efficiency in the lab, because you can essentially generate any material you need. Yeah, but I'm kind of private about that because it's not something I feel the world is ready for. And it's not really information that people have the maturity to harness in the appropriate way.
Right. So to a certain extent, you'll talk about different stuff. I know that you're kind of more open about a lot of the alchemical work than most people. That I know there's I think his name is Dennis Hawk. Actually, I think he's a Rosicrucian teacher. He kind of talks, he has some stuff on YouTube about alchemy. So have you kind of received a lot of criticism from the internal world of alchemy?
I used to. I've corresponded with Dennis. He's actually been rather kind to me. He was the one that gifted me the Paracelsus Award from the Alchemical Guild.
Oh, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah. So the Alchemy Guilds, most people that start researching alchemy will probably find the guild. They'll probably find the alchemy study program, which is like an online education course, which I, as a practicing alchemist, I would never recommend it. Like, no offense to the people that created that or anyone who's taken that class. It's just a waste of your time and money. It's not going to help you understand anything, or be a good practicing alchemist. But yeah, in the beginning, when I first started Kymia and I launched it, I would receive a lot of hate mail from these secret societies, Freemasons, Rosicrucians, the Alchemy Guild, other practicing alchemists. People would really try to mess with me. And basically what everyone was saying is that this is private information. It's only for the initiates. And you cannot be demystifying this. You cannot be, selling these products. You can't share this information. And obviously I didn't agree, because I'm still here and I'm still doing it. And my practice is still growing and still making its way into the world. But it didn't make sense to me, because it's like, well, first off, I never had a teacher. I never had some secret society or apprenticed under somebody or anything. I read basically all of the ancient alchemical manuscripts I could. I traveled the world and I translated. I spoke to, experts at universities and got to go through private libraries. I found people with private book collections who would let me sit in their house and take notes and read their books. And that's how I learned. I educated myself. And it's my understanding, my practice, my expression of this art form. And it is definitely within my power to share my experience. And if I'm not, then I'm not being authentic to who I am and what I've been doing all my life, right? So I never really succumbed to people's interpretations of my work as being bad or false. And I stood my ground, and I'm happy I did, because later on down the path, a lot of those people came back and apologized and even commended me for what I had done, and often, recommend me as a teacher or a resource, which is what the Paracelsus Award is. It is recognition from the Alchemical Guild as being a top-notch resource of traditional alchemical wisdom or practice, which I currently hold ground in both. And I'm proud to have that award. I'm happy that I got recognized finally for what I'm doing and saying, and considered a resource to the guild. So yeah, it's been a wild ride, man. Like, you've probably heard in my other talks and posts and stuff that I literally actually did lose everything when I stepped towards this. I lost my friends, my family, my job, my house, all of my money. And it took me a really long time to get my feet back on the ground. And I was homeless for like 10 years. People thought I had gone crazy. I was being called a devil worshiper and black magician and, Satan incarnate, and you name it. I was a liar. I was a manipulator, whatever. So screw those guys. I'm still here. And yeah, I think that this is amazing that alchemy can finally have an honest, demystified expression using modern language, modern tools, and, you know, just giving that understanding back to the people that find interest in it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, because I guess back then, I mean, I guess there's kind of like a lineage. It's like, you know, you have like Newton, Copernicus, Plato, Aristotle.
Mhm.
You get Pythagoras, and then you have the different, I guess, mystery schools is where they're originally. I guess it all roots to Egypt inevitably, right? With the, I guess, it should be Thoth or Hermes. And then, so I wanted to go talk a little bit more about Hermes and your opinion. So do you think that Hermes was like an actual physical person, or?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, it's always been an archetype, and that archetype is Mercury. So, you know, Thoth, Hermes, and Mercury are all kind of the same entity, but expressed through either the Roman, the Grecian, or the Egyptian cultures. And yes, maybe people have embodied that archetype, but it isn't to say that any one person existed and was Thoth or was Hermes. It's definitely the archetype of the mind, the connecting factor between consciousness and matter, or creator and created, right? So it's cool. Like if you look at that connecting factor, it's the bridge. It's the aspect that kind of draws the line between these two opposing worlds of infinity and finiteness. And you look at the word Hermes, well, that word originally meant a pile of stones or a boundary marker, because in the past, people would place piles of stones to mark boundaries, or, you know, it's kind of like a sign. It's like, okay, this is where this line of ownership ends and a new one begins. And that's how Hermes got his name. He is the boundary marker. He is the one that stands in between these two realms. Mercury is the god that goes between, you know, the infinite realm of gods and the finite realm of men. He is the messenger of the gods. So that's all it really means. It's just looking at archetypes of the mind, the connecting factor between consciousness and matter.
So with the Corpus Hermeticum, do you think that, like, because obviously all these different texts are attributed to Hermes, I guess these were just early people studying alchemy and kind of writing about it, and they over time got compiled. I think there is some pyramid texts that do correlate with a lot of the Hermetica, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Yeah, the Corpus Hermeticum is really kind of drawn from all over the place and slapped together, and no one can say for certain its actual origins or who actually wrote it. And the kind of collection of books that make up the Corpus Hermeticum have been researched and investigated by scientists, and they can clearly see that there is very different writing styles and maybe even very different cultures behind each one of the books, which shows you that it was put together over time. And if somebody was speaking as Hermes himself and that person was actually writing, then it means that they must have just been embodying that archetype, the archetype that connects the infinite realm to the finite realm, the conscious realm to the material realm, right? But it really didn't become popular until it was translated, I think, into Latin by the Medici family in Italy. I don't remember the exact year. I want to say the 1200s, but I'm forgetting now. And that's when it really became popular and pretty much kickstarted the Renaissance, because people started being able to actually read this text. And it had been held in the Arabic-speaking countries for probably thousands of years. They were the ones that really held down a lot of the alchemical wisdom and a lot of the texts. And the only reason we have them today is because they did secure them and they did keep them safe. And later on, people then translated it to Latin, Italian, German, French, you name it, right? Which is how we have it today. So we have to be super thankful. And even that word, alchemy, right? It has that Arabic prefix al, and then the Kim, which is the ancient word for Egypt, is like the Egyptian art, essentially. And they're the ones that gave it to us. They're the ones that held onto it.
So this might be, I don't know, might be related kind of topic, but
Yeah.
do you lend any credence to the theory of the Anunnaki?
Okay.
Familiar
I can. Have you ever read Zachariah Sitchin?
I haven't read it myself, but I've listened to, kind of the different people talk about his works and stuff.
It's interesting. I would highly recommend it for anyone that's interested in potential alien origins for humanity. But basically, as you probably know, Zachariah Sitchin looked at ancient Sumerian mythologies and texts, and translated some of those and gave his perspectives on what they were saying. But they're pretty open and clear. They speak very directly to star systems that we shouldn't have even known about because the telescope apparently wasn't supposed to exist. Star systems and planets and genetic lines and people coming from different solar systems to create humans and the entire historical thing that we have that we can remember. So basically, this story is really cool, actually. I like to tell it sometimes. It's kind of long, so I'm going to have to abbreviate. But the Sumerian texts talk about the origins of the universe. And in the beginning, you have matter coming out of wherever, no one can say for certain. And slowly stars begin to form, and those stars explode and they produce more, dense forms of matter, and that comes together and it makes planets, and those planets then, begin to eventually evolve and grow life. And it was said by the Sumerians that the first planet to gain life was from the star system of Orion, and that as life began to evolve, the first form of intelligence came from a reptilian sort of creature, but that all life is essentially destined to become humanoid in form and highly intelligent. So the Orions were the first. And this is just the story. Don't take my word, right? This is just the Sumerian myths, and this is what kind of Zachariah Sitchin lays down. The Orions were first. They evolved from some reptilian form. And they had their whole thing for probably millions, if not billions of years, where they gain awareness, and then they have all their conflicts and they fight each other, and then they unify and they begin to travel outside the planet, and they do space exploration, and they grow. And they didn't have any awareness of any other intelligent life forms at first, but they gained more advanced technology and more, advanced understandings of matter in the universe. And they expanded, and they went away from their planet, and they began to explore. And as they did, they would find simple life forms here and there. But it wasn't until they reached the Sirian star system that they found the first form of intelligent life. Intelligent life that was extremely close to leaving its own planet and becoming a threat to the Orion Empire. So, seeing this, the Orions, the reptilians, go to the Sirians, and it's said that they evolved from a dog-like creature, which is why we call it the dog star. And even if you look up in the sky, you'll see that the belt of Orion and the star of Sirius are very close to each other. And Sirius is supposed to be Orion's hunting dog. So even in our astrological metaphors, we see this mythology taking place. So anyways, they go to the Sirians, and the Sirians are a warlike culture. They really like to emphasize strength and war and battle and fighting. Think the Predator. It's kind of like that. And they make a deal. They're like, hey, we can see that you're very advanced, you're very powerful, we respect that, and you're getting ready to make some serious changes and probably get off your planet and start exploring outer reaches of space, and we want to make an alliance with you. We have more technology, you have more power. If you become our army, so to speak, and we work together, we can rule the universe together. We can expand. And I'm definitely paraphrasing here, right? And so they agree, and the Orions and the Sirians link up. So long story short, they begin to expand, they go all over the place, but eventually make it to our solar system, which is in the outer reaches. We're way far away from Sirius and Orion. So they're definitely like going real far. So consider this like a far, far, far away outpost. But the Syrian king had sent his two sons, Enlil and Enki, to look over this outpost. And in return, they needed to supply the Orion Empire with resources. So Enlil and Enki, they go and they set up shop. And it's said that they first land on, I think it was Uranus, and they have a colony outside of Uranus. And then Enki was considered the god of Genesis, and he used his understandings of life and matter to terraform planets. And he terraformed Mars, and it was called Marduk. It was the first planet. And he created life there. And then they went and lived there. And they began to mine that planet and utilize its resources and like pay the tax to the Orion government and whatever. But a bunch of drama went down. Long story short, they end up on Earth, blah, blah, blah. They terraform that whole planet. But I can't go into all the details because it's probably going to go forever. But going back to the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki was supposed to be an Orion bloodline. It was pretty much like a race of beings that was said to be more insect-like. That's where they evolved from. I think all of these are humanoid in form, but these insect-like creatures worked for the Orions, the Orion Queen, and they were sent down to Earth to kind of stabilize things, a battle between the two brothers, Enlil and Enki, that took place. I can go way deep into detail on etymology on all of this stuff, but I don't really think that it's what people believe it to be, and I kind of take that stance on most things. Maybe that story is true, maybe it's not, who knows. I can see slivers of its potential reality in my experience, and it does make me question its validity as being authentic, but I can't say for certain, so I take it as an interesting story at this point. Yeah, if you have any further questions, let me know.
You definitely have a lot of information about that. It's just, yeah, it's interesting to me too. I don't know, just something I'm always kind of interested in researching and stuff. So yeah, what I guess for Kymia Arts, we maybe talk a little bit about what you're doing, like as far as your courses and stuff, and kind of your plans for the future and where you're going with all this.
Yeah, so, you know, funny story is that Kymia was never my intention. I never wanted to make a business or a school or sell products or any of that. I honestly tried not to, and I ran away from it a few times, and it chased after me, and no matter what I do, it always is here. So I've accepted that fact. I consider myself a servant to this thing, not in like a negative way, but I'm a caretaker or a nurturer of this expression. And it's my authentic expression. So therefore it's in alignment with me, and it's true, and it's authentic, and it's not, there's no weird agendas on it. But since Kymia exists, and since I have accepted that I am its caretaker, I do my best to see that it gets what it needs. And basically what happens is that, you know, all day, every day, I am literally receiving endless amounts of messages. Like, it is actually insane. And I'm one dude, right? Like, I have a couple of apprentices that help me with my work here and there throughout the day. And you guys are probably starting to see more videos of that as we're making, you know, fun little episodes about our life and our work. But it's basically me and two other people. And we're processing hundreds and hundreds of requests for more information, more products, more help and advice. So I do my best to facilitate. And the way I do that is by offering these apprenticeship courses every once in a while. I can only do it so often because I'm only one guy, and I have to not only make the product and write the content and correspond with everybody, because I'm the only one that understands the things that I understand. And even if you teach somebody, it takes years and years for them to catch up and get to this place where they can become fluent and eloquent in the way they express it, right? And be honest and truthful about it. So yeah, I'm just trying to like hold regular workshops and allow people the opportunity to come and see for themselves what this practice is and how they can perform it in their day-to-day life. It's something that has to be shown, not told. You're never going to get this from a book or a YouTube video. It has to be you have to see it with me. You have to do it with me. And that goes back to the original definition of alchemy. It is the understanding of how consciousness relates to matter. It's not the knowledge of how consciousness relates to matter. It's understanding. Two very different things. Knowledge is the mind. It's the intellect. It is limited to, how far the mind can go. But understanding is purely experiential, and it needs no knowledge to actually have that experience. So alchemy is an understanding, which means it's an experience, which is why I say you're not going to get it in a book or a YouTube video or on my website or on my Instagram. It might stoke the fire or the interest and inspiration, but you got to come and see it. Because it's that way, it makes it kind of difficult for me to spread this information all over the place, which means that people have to come to me. And, I'm out here in New Mexico, I got my lab, and if they really want to get serious about it, then they'll make the effort to come and actually participate in the experience. But that's available, and I hold courses every few months. Obviously, seating is limited because I have a limited amount of space and equipment and time. But I'm doing my best to make that available. And then I'm also trying to show people more through the social media and the website and make products available too. So that's another way to experience it. Maybe you can't come to the class. Maybe you can't build a lab in your house, but you still want to participate. Well, there are the oils and there are the extracts, and they do have effects on the body and the mind, and it can help you see things in a new light and maybe wake up to new understandings and actually experience what I might be talking about. So that's another way for those that can't do that travel or build their own labs. So basically all the expressions you see me pumping out on the internet are what I have to offer, and it's due to the nature of this work. I can definitely say that there will be more written content. I am working on books. I am working on more videos. I am considering major TV shows that will all be coming in the future. But until you step over that line of experience to knowledge, you're considered an armchair alchemist. The armchair alchemist is the guy that sits in his chair all day and reads these books and watches the videos and does whatever and makes his opinions of what he thinks is authentic, but never experiences it for himself. So you might hear that term, armchair alchemist or a puffer. A puffer is also an ancient term for the people that would sit there with their bellows and they would puff the fire and they would try to make the philosopher's stone, but they would never get anywhere. So they're just puffing away forever, So I'm trying to get rid of that by opening up the opportunity for people to either experience it through the products or through the education that I offer.
I think that's amazing and super inspiring. I guess I'll just ask you a couple more questions before we wrap this up. So with your philosophy and all of your work and over the years, what kind of beliefs do you have around death? Do you believe in reincarnation, or what's your take on that?
So I like to only speak from experience. I hold no belief system. I will never believe anything. I can't because of my experience, and my experience is very deep. I have been doing this to its fullest expression. And I do not say that with ego or arrogance. That's just a simple observation of watching me as Avery interact with this art called alchemy. But in my experiences of death, I don't see reincarnation. I don't see multiple individuals. I simply see myself in all things. And this can sound negative and it can sound selfish and arrogant and conceited, but it actually isn't. It is the most loving and freeing thing you can do for yourself and others, the proposed others, right? The people that we assume actually exist outside of ourselves, which they don't. That's all appearances. Death is an illusion. You can't die. You as the creator, as consciousness, and there's only one consciousness, have always existed and always will. And it is the divine mystery. And do your best to wrap your head around it, but it's impossible. knowledge can never actually apprehend infinity. You can only understand it and experience it, which is what alchemy is, an experience and an understanding of how infinity relates to the finite material world. So death is definitely an illusion. Even if this form stops, if you stop being yourself, this human body, you're going to just continue an experience in some other way. So it doesn't make sense to say you're reincarnated even. The experience just continues. It just might continue in a new vehicle or a new, call it a dimension, whatever you want. But any word that designates separateness is an illusion. And I cannot be more firm on that. And it's really, really hard to define, but that is my experience, not my opinion. So with that in mind, it makes it really fun and exciting, especially when you do become proficient in navigating alchemical philosophy and practice. Because if you, let's say you go on Google and you type in Philosopher's Stone and you click on images, the very first image that comes up will be a symbol of the Philosopher's Stone. It will be a circle, within that will be a triangle, and within that will be a square. And that symbol is called the Philosopher's Stone. You'll see it throughout old alchemical woodcuts too. The Philosopher's Stone is first a philosophy. It's an understanding of how matter and experience are generated. And if you understand how any and all experiences are created, then you definitely know how to break them down and rebuild them in different ways. So this is where you get the transmutation. And it's always happening internally. If you can discover the Philosopher's Stone inside first, well, as within, so without. Therefore, it must exist outside of you. It couldn't not. So it has to be a real thing, and it is a real thing, right? Which also leads to the mythologies around the Philosopher's Stone, how it is the universal panacea and can potentially help you live forever and gives you infinite abundance. Well, if you understand how any and all experiences are generated, and that understanding is basically hidden within that little graph called the Philosopher's Stone, and you understand how to produce that Philosopher's Stone outside of you because you understand that as within, so without is a real thing, then yes, you actually did just find the keys to immortality and infinite abundance. So you now have an infinite timeline, and it becomes a matter of navigating it. That's the tricky part. But that too is also explained in alchemy. And it's a big part of what I teach in my classes. I start by teaching, I call it cracking the alchemical code. And then when we crack the alchemical code, we look at this Philosopher's Stone graph, and I break it down piece by piece in modern language so that you can basically translate any alchemical text, you can understand any experience internally and externally, and you can understand how to navigate it perfectly, so that you're always in alignment with truth, you're always living in virtue, you're always within integrity, and you're always in a frictionless flow, which is a state very similar to the Orm's state, a monoatomic state that elements take. So everything begins to overlap and tell the same story. The karmic wheel is broken, the chain of death and birth, that becomes irrelevant. Reincarnation becomes irrelevant. Life and death become the same thing because you can never stop existing. It's a pretty wild experience, and it can be absolutely terrifying in the beginning. I'm not going to lie. There's nothing pleasurable about coming to this understanding. You have to lose everything. You have to lose all of your identity. You might end up in a situation like me where you do lose your friends, your family, your money, your house, all of it. Maybe probably even your mind. Honestly, you will lose your mind. You have to lose your mind. So it sucks. It's scary. It's terrifying. It's painful. I'm going to be totally honest. Everybody puts this friggin' love and light shit all over, waking up and enlightenment. And it's false. There is nothing blissful about the awakening experience. Bliss is an opinion in its own right. As soon as bliss exists, which is pleasure and happiness and joy, it automatically lends to the duality of pain and fear and unhappiness, right? Which is not the truth, because the truth is not dual. It's singular. So it's not love and light. It's not bliss. It's not nirvana. But it is more, it's experienced more often as a painful thing because the human mind or the human ego doesn't want to let go. It has its beliefs, it has its opinions and attachments, and it's really painful when they get ripped away. The belief that you are even a human, the belief that you're even on this planet, all of it is relative. None of it is true. You just take it because that's what you've been told. And so as you wake up to these things and you get deeper into this practice, man, you got to let all of that go. And it's not fun at first because, yeah, you do look pretty crazy. And you will kind of have a hard time with understanding, well, then who am I? What is this thing that I am? But that's when you get into navigating infinity, when you understand that purpose is self-defined. It's a wild ride. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's where my mind went.
I love it. It's beautiful. All right. Where can people find you and what you're doing?
So I have my website, KymiaArts.com, KYMIAARTS. So I have a lot of information on there. I share some lessons. I share my products. There, I have my news feed that tells people when classes are coming up and what kind of is going on. So the Kymia Arts website is a good start. We then, of course, have social media. So there's Instagram and Facebook, and they basically do the same thing, and share the same content, but people like different platforms. So we have to navigate both. And I share more of I do a lot of things. I share more of my day-to-day in the lab. I talk about aspects of this extraction or this method or this philosophy or whatever. Then there, of course, is the YouTube, where I'm starting to produce more video content, showing a bit more about my actual work in the lab so people can see it and understand a bit more about how we approach this. And through those forums, through the website, the social media, and the YouTube, people can contact us. They can leave comments and messages. I do my best to respond or have one of my apprentices respond. If we miss anybody, I apologize. We are actually flooded almost every single day, and stuff does squeak by. And it's not because we don't care or, don't have interest in your expression. It's just rather difficult to manage hundreds of thousands of people that come through when I'm one dude. That's the best way. And usually people will get a hold of me. I'm often the one that's responding. So it's pretty humble, what's going on.
Well, this is awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any last words?
No, thanks a lot, man. I also appreciate this opportunity. I think it's really cool and really beneficial, not only for us to exchange this, but for other people to get to listen to it. And I hope maybe people find some sort of insight or benefit or value. And if not, that's okay too. I got to have a good experience.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again. It was nice talking to you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks a lot, man. Yep.